Some people think kindness needs an audience. They think it has to be big, loud, the kind of thing that gets clapped for. Josie Calder never believed that. In her experience, kindness usually happened quietly, in the middle of a lunch rush, in a stained apron, while nobody was watching at all. And once in a while, if you were very lucky, somebody noticed anyway. The Golden Spoon Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Miller, wedged between a shuttered pawn shop and a laundromat that hummed all day long with the smell of fabric softener drifting out onto the sidewalk. It wasn't glamorous. The booths were cracked red vinyl, patched in places with duct tape nobody bothered to match to the color. The coffee machine had a dent in the side from some long-forgotten Tuesday. But at lunchtime, the place filled up fast, packed with construction workers and office clerks and old men who came in every day at the same hour and ordered the same thing without needing to look at a menu. Josie was 22, with a round face and soft arms and thick dark hair she kept twisted up in a claw clip that never behaved past 11 in the morning. She'd worked at the Golden Spoon for 2 years, ever since she'd dropped out of community college to help her mother with the bills after her father's hours got cut at the plant. Her feet ached by 2 o'clock every day. Her back ached by 4. But she showed up every single shift, and she smiled at people even on the days smiling felt like the hardest job in the world. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She wasn't the kind of waitress that got put on the diner's flyers, the ones advertising friendly hometown service with a photo of somebody thin and blonde holding a coffee pot. She'd caught the looks. She'd heard the little comments customers thought were too quiet to reach her ears. She'd learned, mostly, to let them roll off her, the way rain rolls off a roof that's been rained on plenty of times before. The lunch rush that Thursday started like any other. The bell over the door jingled every few minutes in a steady rhythm of hunger and impatience. Josie was balancing 4 plates up one arm, weaving between tables, when Brenda, the shift manager, snapped her fingers from behind the counter. "Calder, table 9. Brenda ran the floor of the Golden Spoon like she was still angry about a life she'd wanted and never gotten. She was thin in a hard, brittle way, always in lipstick a shade too dark for her face, and she had a gift for making everyone around her feel like they were standing in her way. She'd never liked Josie much. Josie suspected it was because Josie never cracked under Brenda's little jabs the way some of the younger girls did. She just worked. Quietly, steadily, without giving Brenda the satisfaction of a reaction. Brenda found that unbearable, though she'd never have admitted why. Josie set down her tray and glanced toward the door, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. 2 people had just walked in, and even before the door swung shut behind them, she felt the whole diner tilt a few degrees in their direction, the way a room does when everyone senses something without being told what it is. The man in front moved like he'd never once in his life had to wait for anything. Dark hair, a black wool coat over a charcoal suit, no tie, top button undone. His jaw looked like it had been carved out of stone by somebody with very exacting standards. His eyes swept the diner in one slow pass, cataloging exits and faces and the general shape of the room before he decided anything else about it. Behind him, a broad man in a dark jacket held the door for a young woman. She looked to be about 25, slim, dark hair loose past her shoulders, wearing a soft gray cardigan. She moved carefully, her eyes tracking quickly across the room in a pattern that had nothing to do with searching for danger and everything to do with reading faces. Josie recognized that pattern instantly. She'd grown up next door to a girl named Faye who'd been deaf since birth, and she'd watched Faye do exactly this 1,000 times. Scanning a room for mouths she could read, for hands that might speak to her, orienting herself in a world built almost entirely for people who could hear it. "That's Matteo Russo," Brenda hissed, suddenly at Josie's elbow, Voice dropped into a scandalized whisper. "You know who that is?" Josie didn't. Not really. Not beyond rumor. She'd heard the name the way you hear about a storm 2 counties over. Russo ran the freight yards down by the river. Russo's family had been a fixture of this side of the city since before she was born. Russo was not a man whose lunch order you wanted to get wrong. "He's here for lunch," Brenda said, straightening her apron, smoothing an invisible wrinkle out of it. "And nothing embarrassing is happening on my floor today." Her eyes cut sideways to Josie, and something small and mean flickered behind them. An idea. "You, table 9. Go on." "Me?" Josie blinked. "Brenda, I've already got table 4, table 7. "I said go," Brenda said, and there was a little curl at the corner of her mouth now, thin and satisfied. "Let's see how the big leagues treat you, Calder." Josie understood exactly what was happening. Brenda wasn't handing her an opportunity. Brenda was setting her up, hoping the girl who didn't fit the flyer would fumble and blush and embarrass herself in front of the most dangerous man to walk through their door in years, hoping it would finally give her a reason to write Josie up, or worse. It was cruelty wearing the costume of an assignment, and everyone within earshot at the counter knew it. A couple of the other servers traded glances. Nobody said a word. Nobody ever did. Josie smoothed her apron down over her hips, swallowed the lump rising in her throat, and walked toward table 9. The man in the coat was already seated, one arm stretched along the back of the booth, eyes still moving over the room out of habit. The young woman sat across from him, hands folded neatly on the table, gaze fixed on her brother's face, waiting for whatever came next with the particular stillness of someone used to waiting to be included. Josie recognized that, too. Not fear, just distance. The kind of distance that builds up in a room that never quite lets you all the way in. "Afternoon," Josie said, keeping her voice easy, the same tone she used for every table in the place. "Welcome to the Golden Spoon. Can I get you two started with something to drink?" Matteo Russo glanced up at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, running over her quickly and without apology, the way he seemed to size up everything. "Water," he said. "No ice." His voice was low, faintly rough, carrying the shape of a language spoken at home a generation back. He didn't look at his sister when he spoke. He didn't sign to her either. He simply turned back to the laminated menu, as if ordering for 2 people was a task that happened entirely inside his own head, with no need to include the second person at the table. Josie's stomach tightened. She'd seen this before, too, in Faye's own house growing up. Hearing family who loved someone deaf and still somehow never learned to include them. It wasn't always meanness. Sometimes it was just exhaustion, or grief, or simply not knowing how. But from the outside it always looked the same. A person sitting right there, present and somehow not. The young woman was watching her brother's mouth, trying to catch the shape of whatever he'd just ordered. Josie saw a flash of frustration cross her face, quickly folded away, the practiced patience of somebody who'd been doing this her whole life. Josie crouched slightly, bringing herself down to the young woman's eye level, and signed. "Hi, I'm Josie. What can I get you to drink?" The young woman's eyes went wide. Nobody at the table moved for a second. Matteo's head snapped up from the menu, his dark eyes narrowing on Josie with an intensity that made her pulse jump straight into her throat. The bodyguard by the door shifted his weight, watching. But Josie kept her focus on the young woman, on the astonishment blooming across her face like a sunrise nobody had warned her was coming. "You sign?" The young woman signed back, hands moving fast, eager, like she hadn't gotten to use them properly with a stranger in a long while. "You really know ASL?" "My neighbor growing up was deaf," Josie signed. "Learned before I really knew what it meant. What's your name?" "Tori," the young woman signed, and then, almost shy, "Vittoria, nobody talks to me here. Nobody really talks to me anywhere." Something cracked open warm in Josie's chest. She smiled, and it wasn't the practiced customer service smile she'd worn 1,000 times a shift for 2 straight years. It was real, all the way through. "Well, I'm talking to you now," she signed. "What do you want to drink, Tori?" Tori laughed, silent but full-bodied, shoulders shaking with it. "Iced tea. Lemon, please." Josie straightened and looked over at Matteo, who was staring at her like she'd just done a magic trick in the middle of his lunch. His jaw was tight. His eyes hadn't left her face. "Water, no ice for you," Josie said. "Iced tea with lemon for Tori. I'll be right back." She turned and walked away before either of them could say anything else, heart hammering so loud she was sure the whole diner could hear it. Behind the counter, Brenda was staring at her, mouth slightly open, the cruel little smile long gone. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and grilled onions, and Josie leaned against the steel counter for exactly 4 seconds, just breathing, before she grabbed a glass and started scooping ice for Tori's tea. "What was that?" hissed Renee, the other server on shift, sliding up beside her at the drink station. Renee was 24, sharp-eyed, endlessly curious about everyone's business but hers. "You were doing hand stuff at their table. What was that?" "Sign language," Josie said, slicing a lemon with more force than the lemon strictly deserved. "The sister's deaf. Nobody was talking to her." Renee's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. "That's Matteo Russo's sister. You know that, right? Like, the Russo." "I heard." "You just signed with the Russo's deaf sister right in front of the Russo," Renee said, like she was testing the sentence to see if it sounded as insane out loud as it felt in her head. "Brenda sent you over there to get embarrassed. Everybody clocked it. And instead you just—" She waved a hand vaguely at Josie's fingers. "That." Josie didn't answer. She poured the tea, added the lemon, set both drinks on a tray, and walked back out onto the floor before her nerves could talk her out of it. When she reached the table, Tori's face lit up again, and this time Matteo was watching his sister's expression instead of the room. Something in his posture had shifted, just slightly. The stillness hadn't left him, but a crack had opened in it, something curious peeking through. "Here we go," Josie said, setting the glasses down. She signed as she spoke, out of pure habit now, unable to stop herself. "Iced tea. Enjoy." "Wait," Matteo said before she could step away. Josie froze. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd looked from across the room. There was an economy to the way he held himself, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that wasted motion could cost you something. But his eyes, settled on her now, weren't cold. They were curious and something else she couldn't name yet. "You sign," he said. Not really a question, but it hung there like one anyway. "Since I was 7, Josie said. Grew up next door to a girl who was deaf. Picked it up before I knew what I was picking up." Matteo glanced at his sister who was watching the exchange, trying to read Josie's lips to keep pace with a conversation moving too fast for her to fully catch. He said something to Tori then, slow, halting, hands moving in imperfect signs. He fumbled, glanced at Josie almost helplessly. "How do you sign diner?" Josie showed him. He repeated it, clumsy but trying, and Tori's whole face transformed, delighted, encouraging, the way you'd cheer somebody's first wobbling steps. It was clear watching them that Matteo knew a handful of signs, just not many, nowhere near enough. "You know some," Josie said gently. "Took a class once," Matteo admitted, and there was something almost boyish in it, a crack of vulnerability strangely at odds with the rest of him. Years ago, before things got... He stopped himself, glanced away, jaw tightening. Before I got busy. Never kept it up. Nobody in the family really did. Tori's hands moved, sharp and quick, clearly aimed at her brother, and even without knowing much sign, Josie could read the exasperation in the shape of it. She says you promised to practice with her every Sunday, Josie translated, a smile tugging at her mouth despite herself. And you haven't in... She paused, watching Tori's fingers. 4 months? Mateo winced. 5. 5, Tori signed emphatically, holding up her fingers, glaring at her brother with the particular fondness of someone who loved a man too much to stay actually mad at him. For the first time since walking through the door, Matteo Russo laughed. It came out short, surprised out of him, and it changed his whole face, softened the hard lines around his eyes. I'll come back for your order whenever you're ready, Josie said, feeling like she was suddenly intruding on something that had nothing to do with her. Give us a minute, Matteo said. Then, glancing at his sister, he added something with his hands, slow and clumsy, asking her about the menu. Tori beamed and started signing back, patient, coaching him through it the way you'd coach somebody through something they were finally trying for real. Josie slipped away, and as she did, she caught Matteo's eyes one more second. Something in them now hadn't been there when he first walked in. Not the cold assessment of a man cataloging threats. Something warmer, a little lost, like a man who'd just been reminded of something he'd forgotten he was allowed to want. Brenda cornered Josie by the coffee station 20 minutes later, voice pitched low and furious. What exactly do you think you're doing? My job, Josie said, refilling a carafe, not looking up. Your job is to take orders and bus tables, not to, Brenda gestured wildly, befriend dangerous men and their families. Do you have any idea who that is? Do you understand what could happen if you say the wrong thing? If you upset him? I signed with his sister, Josie said evenly. That's it. Nobody's upset. You don't know that. Brenda's voice cracked with something under the anger that sounded a lot like fear, and Josie realized, suddenly, that this wasn't really about propriety at all. Brenda was scared, plain and simple, the way people got scared around men whose names carried weight nobody wanted to test. I put you on that table to... She stopped herself short. To embarrass me, Josie finished quietly. I know, Brenda. I've worked here 2 years. I know exactly what you were doing. Brenda's mouth opened, then shut. For half a second, something almost like shame flickered across her face before she smothered it. Just don't make trouble, she snapped instead, and stalked off toward the register, heels clicking hard against the tile. Josie let out a slow breath and got back to work. Table 4 needed refills. Table 7's check hadn't been dropped yet. The lunch rush didn't care about crime bosses or deaf sisters or managers with mean streaks. It just kept coming. Plate after plate, order after order, and Josie let herself sink into the rhythm of it, grateful for something to do with her hands. She checked on table 9 twice more over the next half hour. Both times, she found brother and sister deep in a slow, halting conversation. Matteo fumbling through signs he half remembered, Tori patiently correcting him, both of them laughing more than Josie suspected they had together in a long while. It did something strange in her chest, watching them. A tightness that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy, sitting somewhere in the space between the two. The rest of the diner carried on around them, oblivious to the small, private miracle unfolding at table 9. A trucker at the counter argued cheerfully with the cook about whether the pancakes were better on weekdays or weekends. A woman in scrubs, clearly on break from the urgent care clinic 2 doors down, read a paperback with one hand and ate a grilled cheese with the other. Nobody noticed the man everyone in this part of the city knew by reputation, sitting quietly in a corner booth, learning, badly and gladly, how to talk to his own sister. When she brought the check, Mateo held up a hand before she could set it down. "What's your name?" he asked. "Full name." "Josie Calder," she said, wary now. Men like him didn't usually ask questions without a reason attached. Josie Calder. He repeated it like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. He glanced at his sister, who was watching the exchange with open curiosity, then back at Josie. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years. "You like it?" Josie hesitated. The honest answer and the safe answer weren't the same thing, and she wasn't sure which one to give a man who could, for all she knew, make her life difficult with one phone call. "It pays the bills," she said finally. "Most days." Something in his expression sharpened, like he'd caught the careful diplomacy in her answer and filed that away too. "Most days," he echoed. He reached into his coat, pulled out a slim black wallet, and set several bills on the table without counting them out loud, without making a show of it. "Thank you for today," he said. "You have no idea what you just gave her." "Thank you," Tori signed, and then, slower, more deliberate, watching Josie's face to be sure she caught it. "Please come back. I want to talk to you again." Josie felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I'd like that," she signed back. They left a few minutes later, Mateo's hand resting light and careful on his sister's shoulder as they crossed to the door, the bodyguard falling into step behind them. Josie watched them go, then looked down at the table, at the check tucked beneath a small stack of bills. She nearly dropped the tray when she counted it. $280 for a lunch that came to $26. She stood there a long moment, staring at the money, feeling the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with the number and everything to do with what it meant. Not charity, not pity, something closer to gratitude, offered the only way a man like Matteo Russo apparently knew how, loudly, in cash, without a single word of explanation. She didn't know yet that it was only the beginning. The knock at Josie's apartment door came 3 days later, right around 7 in the evening, while she was standing at the stove stirring a pot of soup for dinner. She lived in a narrow second-floor unit with her mother, Diane, in a building that smelled permanently of somebody else's cooking and had a radiator that clanked all night long like it was arguing with itself. It had character, her mother always said, which was a polite way of describing a lock that stuck if you didn't jiggle it just right. Josie wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to answer it, expecting maybe her downstairs neighbor asking to borrow sugar again. Instead, she found Matteo Russo standing in her narrow hallway, looking almost comically out of place against the peeling paint and the flickering hallway light, wearing a dark wool coat over a black sweater, hands in his pockets. "Mr. Russo," Josie said, too startled for anything more articulate. "Matteo," he corrected, "or Teo if you'd rather." "How do you know where I live?" "I asked," he said, as if that answered everything, and, honestly, given who he was, it probably did. "I should have called first. I didn't have your number." Behind her, she heard her mother's footsteps approaching, curious, and then a sharp intake of breath as Diane Calder took in the man standing in her doorway, the coat, the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than a month's rent, the careful, controlled way he held himself. "Mama," Josie said quickly, "this is Mr. Russo. I served him and his sister at the diner." "Matteo," he said again, extending a hand to Diane with an easy, practiced warmth Josie hadn't seen at the diner table, a kind of charm he seemed to switch on for certain rooms and not others. "Pleasure, Mrs. Calder. Sorry to bother you at dinner." Diane shook his hand, clearly flustered, clearly recognizing the name, even if she couldn't have said exactly why it made her pulse pick up. "Not a bother at all," she managed. "Would you like to come in?" "I won't take much of your time," Matteo said, though he stepped just over the threshold anyway, glancing around the small apartment with an expression Josie couldn't quite place. Not judgment, not pity, something closer to curiosity, the look of a man taking in a life different from his own and finding himself unexpectedly interested in its details. He turned back to Josie. "I have a proposition," he said. "For you. Business." Josie's stomach dropped, old instincts flaring. "I don't really do business with—" She stopped, glanced at her mother, chose her words more carefully. "I'm not looking for trouble, Mr. Russo." "It's not trouble," he said. "I promise you that. Can we sit?" They sat at the small kitchen table, the soup pot forgotten on the stove, Diane hovering nearby with the protective energy of a mother who didn't yet know whether to be worried or grateful. Matteo folded his hands on the table, that same careful, controlled posture, and looked at Josie directly. "My sister hasn't stopped talking about you," he said, "signing about you, constantly, to anyone who'll pay attention, which lately is mostly Marcus, and Marcus knows maybe 5 signs, all of them related to coffee." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She wants to see you again, and I—" He paused, and for a second the careful composure cracked, something more honest showing through. "I want to learn, properly. Not a 6-week class I quit the second work gets busy. I want somebody to teach me and actually hold me to it. My sister deserves a brother who can talk to her." "There are professional interpreters," Josie said carefully. "Certified tutors. People who do this for a living, way more qualified than a diner waitress who picked it up from a neighbor." "I don't want a professional," Matteo said. "I want somebody Tori already trusts. Somebody she lit up around in a way I haven't seen in—" He shook his head slightly. "A long time. I'll pay you. Well, 2 evenings a week, at my house. You'd teach us both. Whatever you make hourly at the diner, I'll triple it." Josie glanced at her mother, who was doing a poor job hiding her interest, eyes flicking between the stack of unpaid bills on the counter and the man sitting at her kitchen table like it wasn't strange at all that a crime boss was negotiating a tutoring contract over soup going cold on the stove. "Why me?" Josie asked. "You could hire anyone." Matteo was quiet a moment, considering the question with more seriousness than it probably called for. "Because you looked at her first," he said finally. "Before you looked at me, before you even knew who I was, you crouched down and talked to my sister like she was the most important person at that table. Nobody does that. Not the doctors we've hired, not the tutors, not half our own family, if I'm honest. Everybody talks to me about her. You talk to her." He held Josie's eyes. "That's not a small thing to me, Miss Calder." The kitchen was quiet except for the soft bubble of soup on the stove, starting to catch. Josie thought about the mean little smile on Brenda's face when she'd assigned Table 9. She thought about 2 years of double shifts and a paycheck that never stretched far enough. She thought about Tori's face lighting up like a sunrise across a diner booth. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Diane waited exactly until the door closed behind Matteo before she turned to her daughter with wide, delighted eyes. "Josie Marie Calder," she said, "you cannot just casually mention that the Russo family wants to hire you like it's a part-time job at the drugstore." "It kind of is a part-time job," Josie said, though her hands were shaking slightly as she went back to the stove to rescue the soup. "Just a very well-paying, slightly terrifying one." "Is he single?" Diane asked, entirely too innocently. "Mama." "I'm just asking." The Russo house sat up on a ridge outside town, behind a gate that rolled open as the car approached, up a long drive lined with birch trees, the house itself old stone and dark timber. The kind of place that looked like it had been standing 100 years and would stand 100 more. Josie had never been anywhere like it. She sat in the back of Mateo's car on her first visit, hands folded in her lap, trying hard not to gawk out the window like a tourist on a bus tour. Marcus, the broad-shouldered man from the diner, drove. He gave her a small nod in the rearview mirror when she climbed in, which she'd later learn was, for Marcus, practically a hug. Tori met her at the door, practically bouncing, and pulled Josie inside before Mateo had even parked the car. "You came," Tori signed, grinning. "I told Teo you would, but he was nervous you'd change your mind." "I don't back out on things," Josie signed back, and Tori's grin widened even further. The house, up close, was less intimidating than Josie had braced for. Yes, there were quiet men in dark suits stationed here and there, watchful, but the rooms themselves were warm. Worn leather furniture, shelves crowded with books in English and Italian both, a kitchen that smelled permanently of garlic and rosemary. An older woman named Concetta ran the household with brisk, cheerful efficiency, and she took an immediate, fierce liking to Josie, pressing pastries into her hands before she'd even gotten her coat off. "Sit, sit," Concetta insisted, thick accent, a plate appearing under Josie's nose before she'd finished her first sentence. "You work too hard. I can tell just from your shoulders. Eat something." Josie, who had rarely in her life been fussed over quite like this, felt something warm settle in her chest anyway, at the easy, unthinking kindness of it. The lessons started simply. Josie taught them the alphabet first, even though Mateo half knew it already, insisting they build from a steady foundation instead of skipping ahead. She taught greetings, family words, food words, the practical, everyday vocabulary Tori needed most, and that Mateo, embarrassingly, had never quite mastered despite years of living beside his sister. Mateo turned out to be a terrible student in the particular way that powerful men often are. Impatient with himself, frustrated when his hands wouldn't cooperate, prone to giving up mid-sign and switching back to speaking out loud, forgetting for a beat that Tori couldn't hear him. "You're doing it again," Josie said gently, during their third session, as Mateo muttered under his breath after fumbling the sign for "understand" for the fourth time in a row. "Talk to her with your hands, not your mouth. She can't catch it if you're not looking at her." "I know," Mateo said, dragging a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. "I know that. I just—" He glanced at his sister, who was watching him with patient, familiar exasperation, the look of someone who'd waited a long time for this and wasn't about to let a little frustration scare her brother off. "I want to be good at this. Fast. I don't have a lot of patience for being bad at things." "Nobody's good at this fast," Josie said. "Took me years, and I started as a kid, when your brain's basically a sponge. You're allowed to be bad at it for a while. Tori's not going anywhere." "He's always like this," Tori signed, rolling her eyes fondly. "Wants to win at everything the first try. Drove our mother up a wall." Josie translated, and Mateo laughed despite himself, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders. "She's not wrong," he admitted. "Our mother used to say I came out negotiating terms." It settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Josie would finish her shift at the diner, change out of her uniform in the cramped back room, and Marcus would be waiting outside to drive her up to the house. She taught Tori first, usually, building her vocabulary, talking with her about her life. Tori loved painting, it turned out, and kept a small studio on the second floor full of half-finished canvases in bold, bright colors. A whole visual language she'd built for herself in a world that too often forgot to build one for her. Then Mateo would join, awkward and determined, working through his own frustration, one clumsy sign at a time. One evening, a few weeks in, Josie arrived to find the house unusually tense. Two men she didn't recognize stood near the front gate, and Marcus, walking her up the drive, kept glancing over his shoulder in a way that made her stomach knot. "Everything okay?" she asked carefully. "Business," Marcus said, which was, she was learning, the word everyone in this house used when they meant, "Don't ask." "Nothing for you to worry about." Inside, Matteo was on the phone in his study, voice low and clipped, the door only partway shut. Josie caught fragments. "Shipment, Tuesday. I don't care what he says." Before Tori, waiting for her by the stairs, gently tugged her sleeve and led her up to the studio instead, away from the closed door and whatever was happening behind it. "He gets like this sometimes," Tori signed, settling onto her stool in front of an unfinished canvas, a wash of blues and grays that looked, Josie thought, a little like a storm rolling in off water. "Work stuff. He never tells me what exactly. I used to ask. I stopped asking a long time ago." "Does that bother you?" Josie signed. Tori considered the question, brush hovering over her palate. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I think he protects me from it because he loves me, not because he doesn't trust me." She smiled, a little wry. "There's a difference. Took me years to believe that, though." By the time Matteo joined them 40 minutes later, whatever had put the tension in his shoulders had eased, though not entirely. He apologized for being late, dropped into the chair across from Josie, and worked through that evening's lesson with a distracted kind of determination, like the practice itself was a way of setting the rest of it down for a while. "You seem tired," Josie said, after Tori had gone to wash her paintbrushes. "I am," Matteo admitted, more honestly than she expected. "It's not always like this. Most days it's just business, boring business, contracts and shipping manifests and men complaining about each other. Tonight was—" he paused, chose his words carefully. "A little more than that. It's handled. You don't have to tell me what it was." "I know," he said. "I appreciate that you don't ask. Most people either pretend my whole life is danger all the time, or they pretend none of it is. Neither one's true. It's mostly boring. Sometimes it isn't." He looked at her, something almost apologetic in his expression. "I'd understand if that scared you off eventually." "It hasn't yet," Josie said simply, and something in his face eased at that, like he'd been braced for a different answer. Josie found herself, against every instinct of self-preservation, actually looking forward to his company. He was sharper than she'd expected, quick to pick up patterns once he stopped fighting his own impatience. He asked good questions, not just about grammar, but about the deaf community itself, about what it had actually been like for Tori growing up hearing in a hearing family, about the frustrations Josie's old neighbor Faye had described to her over the years. He listened, really listened, in a way that surprised her from a man whose reputation suggested he never had to listen to anyone. "Can I ask you something?" he said one evening, after Tori had gone up to her studio to work on a canvas, leaving the two of them at the kitchen table with the last of Conchetta's coffee. "Sure." "Your manager, Brenda." He said the name carefully, like he'd been saving it up. "The way she looked at you that first day, sending you to our table, that wasn't a compliment, was it?" Josie hesitated, then decided there was no point pretending otherwise. Matteo Russo did not strike her as a man easily fooled. "She doesn't like me much," she admitted. "I think she thinks I don't fit whatever image she's going for. I'm not exactly—" she gestured vaguely at herself— "the look she wants on the floor." Something dark passed over Matteo's face, quick and controlled, but Josie caught it. "That's her loss," he said, flat, certain, stating it like a fact rather than offering comfort. "She sent the wrong girl over to get embarrassed, and ended up sending the only person in that whole diner who could actually see my sister." That's not bad luck for you, Josie. That's bad management. Josie didn't quite know what to say to that. She busied herself with her coffee cup instead, cheeks warming. I mean it, Mateo said, quieter now. You should know your worth. It's not measured by whether Brenda thinks you fit some picture in her head. Easy to say when you own half the freight yards, Josie said, trying to lighten it, though her voice came out softer than she meant. Maybe, Mateo allowed. Doesn't make it less true. It was nearly 2 months in when Josie found out, secondhand, exactly how much trouble Brenda had actually caused herself. She arrived for her Saturday shift to find Renee waiting by the back door, practically vibrating with barely contained gossip. You didn't hear? Renee said, before Josie had even clocked in. Brenda got called into the district office yesterday. Somebody apparently complained about how she runs the floor. Word is she's on some kind of final warning. Josie frowned, tying her apron. What happened? Nobody knows exactly, Renee said, though her tone suggested she had plenty of theories. But it's weird timing, right? Right after the whole Russo thing. She lowered her voice, glancing around. You don't think? I don't know anything about it, Josie said honestly, though a small, uneasy feeling settled into her stomach anyway. She found out the truth 2 days later, when Mateo mentioned it almost in passing during their Tuesday lesson, like it wasn't a big deal, like it wasn't the kind of thing that could upend somebody's entire career. I made a call, he said, when Josie asked him point blank whether he'd had anything to do with it. He didn't even try to deny it. I know somebody at the district level. We've done business before. Supply contracts. Nothing you need to worry about. I mentioned one of your managers was treating her staff badly. That's all. That's all, Josie repeated, torn between gratitude and genuine alarm. Teo, you can't just... People don't just get a call made because someone was mean to a waitress. I can, Mateo said simply. And I did. She sent you to our table hoping you'd fail in front of a dangerous man. She was willing to use your discomfort as a punchline. That's not a small thing to me, Josie. I don't let small things like that slide. Not when I'm able to do something about it. I could have handled Brenda myself. I know you could have, Mateo said, and there was something gentler in his voice now, undercutting the flat certainty from a moment before. That's not why I did it. I did it because I could, and because it was right, and because you shouldn't have to handle everything alone just because you're capable of it. He held her gaze. You've been doing that a long time, haven't you? Handling everything alone. Josie looked away first, throat tight, unprepared for how accurately he'd landed on something she hadn't said out loud to anyone in a while. It's really not your business, she said, though there wasn't much heat behind it. No, Mateo agreed. It isn't. I'm making it my business anyway. You'll have to forgive me for that. She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to stop either. And something about that silence felt like its own kind of admission. Brenda wasn't fired outright, but she transferred to a location across town within the month, and the new manager who took over, a mild, forgetful man named Harold, who always had a pen tucked behind his ear, turned out to be the kind of boss who actually noticed when his staff looked worn thin, and said thank you at the end of a shift. Josie didn't examine too closely how much of that improvement traced back to a phone call she hadn't asked for. She let herself, for once, simply be glad of it. The lessons with Tori and Mateo kept going, and something in their rhythm began shifting, quietly, over the following weeks. Josie found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays in a way that had nothing to do with the money, though the money certainly helped. Her mother had finally gotten the old water heater replaced, and there was, for the first time in longer than Josie could remember, a small cushion in their savings instead of a constant scramble toward zero. But it was more than the money. It was the way Tori had started signing faster, looser, no longer softening her language around Josie the way she softened it for hearing people who barely understood her. Trusting Josie enough to be fully, unapologetically herself. It was the way Mateo's hands had gotten steadier week over week, his signs cleaner, the frustration in his face slowly giving way to something like pride whenever he strung together a full sentence without stumbling. It was the way Conchetta had started setting a third place at the family table without being asked. The way Marcus had picked up enough sign-watching from the doorway that he could now clumsily ask Tori whether she wanted extra bread with dinner. Josie started bringing small things with her, on her own initiative, unrelated to the lessons. A picture book with a deaf protagonist she'd found at a used bookstore for Tori. A laminated cheat sheet of common phrases she'd made for Mateo to keep in his coat pocket for whenever he found himself stuck. Little things. Things nobody had asked her for. She told herself it was just good teaching practice. She wasn't sure, even then, that she believed herself. It was the way Mateo looked at Josie now, when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not the assessing, cataloging look from that first afternoon at the diner. Something softer. Something that made her pulse do inconvenient things she tried very hard to ignore. She told herself it was nothing. He was a client, in a manner of speaking. A very wealthy, very dangerous, very complicated client who happened to be paying her an absurd hourly rate to teach sign language to his family. That was all. That had to be all. It stopped being all on a Thursday evening in early autumn, when the lesson had wrapped up and Tori had gone to bed early with a headache, and Josie found herself alone with Mateo out on the back porch, sharing the last of a bottle of sparkling water Conchetta had left out, looking over the dark shapes of the birch trees against a sky just beginning to bruise purple with dusk. "Can I tell you something?" Mateo said, after a long, comfortable silence. "Sure." "Before you started coming here, I used to sit across from my sister at dinner 4 or 5 nights a week, and I couldn't have told you a single thing we talked about, because we didn't talk about anything. I'd nod, she'd nod back. We loved each other and sat in the same room, and there was this whole," he gestured, searching for the word, "this whole wall between us, and I told myself that was just how it was, that I was doing my best, that some things just couldn't be fixed." Josie didn't say anything, sensing he wasn't finished. "You walked into our lives and just," he shook his head slightly, "took the wall down, like it was nothing. Like it wasn't this impossible thing I'd convinced myself I couldn't touch. And I keep trying to figure out how to thank you for that, and every time I think I've found the right way, it feels too small." "You've thanked me plenty," Josie said softly. "The money, Brenda. You don't owe me anything else." "That's not what I mean," Mateo said, turning to face her fully now. Something raw and unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen from him before, not even in their most relaxed moments. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like a business proposal, because that's mostly how I talk. It's a bad habit, but," he exhaled, frustrated with himself in a way that was almost endearing. "I like you, Josie, not just for what you've done for my sister. I like sitting across from you Tuesdays and Thursdays. I like the way you correct my signs without making me feel stupid for getting them wrong. I like that you argue with me about half of what I say. I think about you when you're not here, which is inconvenient, because I have a business to run and I don't have a lot of room in my life for distractions." He paused. "You're a fairly large distraction." Josie felt heat rush up her neck into her face, a strange mix of embarrassment and something else. Something dangerously close to hope. "I'm a waitress," she said, because it was the only defense she could think to reach for. You're Matteo Russo. Those are different worlds." They are, he agreed. I won't pretend otherwise. My world has ugly corners, Josie. Corners I've spent years trying to keep away from Tori. And I'd want to keep them away from you, too. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's simple. He held her gaze steadily. But I've spent a long time assuming the ugly parts of my life meant I didn't get to have the good parts, too. I'm tired of assuming that. I'd like to stop. Josie sat with that for a long moment, the sparkling water going flat and warm between them, the last light draining out of the sky over the birch trees. She thought about 2 years of double shifts, of Brenda's cruel little smile, of a lifetime of being the girl people looked past, or looked at and found lacking. She thought about a diner booth and a young woman's face lighting up because, for once, somebody had simply looked at her first. I don't scare easy, she said finally, but I won't pretend this doesn't scare me a little. Good, Mateo said, the corner of his mouth curving up. Means you're paying attention. He reached across the small space between them, slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull back, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm, steady, fingers closing gently around hers. Whatever this is, Josie, I'm not in a hurry. We go as slow as you need. Josie looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, and something in her chest that had been braced and guarded for a very long time, finally, quietly, let go. Okay, she said, slow. Word travels fast in a city where everybody knows everybody's business, and it wasn't long before the rumor made its way back to the Golden Spoon that the newish waitress, the round-faced one who used to get stuck with the worst tables, had somehow ended up close with the Russo family, close enough that a sleek black car picked her up twice a week outside the diner, close enough that people started treating her differently, some with new deference, some with the particular resentment reserved for anyone who seems, suddenly, to have gotten lucky. Renee cornered her one slow Wednesday afternoon, eyes gleaming with curiosity she could barely contain. Okay, you have to tell me, she said, leaning against the counter while Josie restocked napkins. Is it true? You and Matteo Russo? Josie felt her face warm, but she didn't deny it. It's complicated, she said, which was true, and also not really an answer. Complicated how? Like, we're figuring it out complicated? Or, I'm dating a man who probably owns actual guns complicated? Honestly, both, Josie admitted, and Renee laughed, delighted, and didn't press further, which Josie appreciated more than she could say. Harold, for his part, seemed to know exactly what was going on, and had the good sense never to mention it directly, though he did start putting Josie on shorter shifts without being asked, and once, awkwardly, told her she should take whatever good thing's happening and not overthink it, which was about as close to blessing as Harold ever got about anything. The truth was, it was complicated, in ways that had little to do with danger and much more to do with the ordinary, terrifying vulnerability of letting yourself want something you'd spent years convincing yourself you didn't deserve. Josie had built her whole life around being useful, being steady, being the one who showed up and never asked for much back. Matteo Russo, for all his wealth and reputation, had somehow become the first person in a long time who looked at her and seemed to want to give rather than take. It wasn't perfect. There were dinners interrupted by phone calls he stepped away to take in a low, clipped voice that made his jaw go tight when he came back. There were nights Marcus drove her home instead of Matteo, because something had come up, something Matteo never fully explained, and Josie learned, slowly, not to push too hard on. She understood, in a vague, unspoken way, that there were parts of his life that would always exist behind a closed door, parts he was trying, however imperfectly, to keep separate from her and from Tori both. One night, Marcus drove her home in near total silence, more tense than usual, and when she asked, gently, if everything was all right, he only said, better than yesterday, and left it at that. Josie didn't press. She'd learned that much, at least, that some doors in this family stayed shut not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because Matteo genuinely believed some weights weren't meant to be shared, and that trying to force the door open faster than he was ready to open it would only make him retreat further behind it. But there were also Tuesday and Thursday dinners that stretched longer than they needed to, full of laughter and clumsy sign language, and Concetta insisting everyone eat more than they possibly could hold. There was Tori, who had started sending Josie little sketches through Matteo's phone, quick, playful drawings of the three of them, always signing something to each other, always smiling. There was the slow, steady build of trust, made one honest conversation at a time, the way real trust is actually built, not in grand gestures, but in the small, boring consistency of somebody showing up when they say they will. 6 months after that first lunch, on a bright Sunday afternoon, Matteo invited Josie and her mother up to the house for dinner. Diane fretted for a week about what to wear, ironed the same blouse twice, and spent the whole car ride up rehearsing small talk she never once needed. Dinner sprawled across the long wooden table in the Russo dining room, Concetta bringing out course after course despite everyone's protests that they couldn't possibly eat more. Diane and Concetta bonding almost instantly over a shared conviction that no guest should ever leave a table hungry. Tori sat beside Josie, signing rapid-fire jokes that had both of them laughing, while Matteo sat at the head of the table, quieter than usual, watching the whole scene with an expression Josie hadn't seen on him before. At one point, Diane leaned over to Josie, lowering her voice beneath the general clatter of the table. "I like him," she said simply. "I like all of them. I haven't seen you laugh like this in years, baby. Not since before your father lost the good hours." Josie squeezed her mother's hand under the table, throat tight, and didn't trust herself to answer out loud. Later, after the plates had been cleared and Diane and Concetta had disappeared into the kitchen still deep in conversation, and Tori had gone upstairs to grab a sketchbook to show Josie, Matteo found Josie out on the back porch again, the same spot where he'd first told her how he felt. "Your mother," he said, coming to stand beside her, looking out at the birch trees just visible in the porch light. "She's wonderful. Reminds me a little of mine before she passed. That same way of feeding everyone until they surrender." "She thinks you're wonderful too," Josie said. "She's already planning what she's bringing to the next dinner. Fair warning, it's going to be a lot of casserole." Matteo laughed softly, then went quiet a moment and reached for her hand, the same way he had 6 months before, though there was less hesitation in it now, more certainty. "I used to think I had 2 lives," he said, "the one everyone sees and the real one underneath it, with Tori, with the people I actually love. I kept them separate because I told myself that was the only way to protect the second one. But you didn't ask permission to walk into both. You just," he shook his head, searching for the words, "made it one life. I don't know how to thank you for that. I keep saying I don't know how, and I keep meaning it more every time I say it." "You don't have to thank me," Josie said. "I didn't do any of it to be thanked." "I know," Matteo said. "That's exactly why I want to." He turned to face her fully, something almost nervous in his expression now, an uncertainty that looked strange on a man who commanded whole rooms without trying. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Josie's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not proposing," he said quickly, catching the look on her face, a small, self-conscious laugh escaping him. "Not yet. You'll know when I am, and it won't be on a porch 20 minutes after your mother taught Concetta how to make her casserole. But I wanted to give you this." He opened the box. Inside sat a delicate silver bracelet, simple and elegant, with a small charm shaped like 2 hands clasped together. Tori picked it out. She's been planning this for a month, dragged me to 3 different shops until she found exactly the right one. She wanted you to have something that means what you gave her, what you gave both of us. Josie's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected, and she let him fasten the bracelet around her wrist, the metal cool and light against her skin. "Tell her thank you," Josie said, voice thick. "Tell her yourself," Matteo said, smiling, nodding toward the kitchen door, where Tori stood just inside, sketchbook forgotten under her arm, watching them with her whole face lit up. Josie laughed through her tears and signed it across the porch, slow and clear, so Tori could catch every word. "Thank you. It's beautiful." "Thank you." "You're welcome," Tori signed back, grinning, and then added, almost shy, "Welcome to the family, if he ever actually asks." "Working on it," Matteo said, out loud and with his hands both, and drew Josie into him, her head resting against his chest, his arms warm and solid around her, the porch light casting long gold shadows across the birch trees. "That's exactly how it should be." The months that followed settled into something Josie had never quite let herself imagine having, a life with room in it. Diane started coming up to the house on her own sometimes, on afternoons when Josie was still at the diner, just to sit in Conchetta's kitchen and trade recipes and complaints about their respective knees. Marcus, of all people, became something like a friend, teaching Josie how to parallel park the enormous car he drove with far more patience than she expected from a man who looked like he could bend a lamppost with his bare hands. Tori's paintings started selling, quietly, through a small gallery downtown that Matteo had connected her with, careful never to reveal whose sister she was, letting the work stand entirely on its own. There were harder days, too. A week in early winter when Matteo disappeared for 3 days on business he never explained, coming home gray around the eyes and saying almost nothing at dinner, and Josie learned to sit with him in the silence rather than push against it, learned that sometimes the kindest thing she could offer was simply not asking. There was an evening when 2 unfamiliar cars idled outside the diner for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away, and Marcus showed up unannounced the next morning to walk Josie to her shift, a change in routine neither of them discussed out loud, but that Josie understood without needing it explained. She didn't know, and didn't ask, exactly what business rivalry or old grudge had prompted it. She only knew that whatever it was, Matteo made sure it never touched her directly, the way he seemed determined nothing sharp-edged in his world would ever be allowed to reach the ones he loved if he could help it. A year is a long time to build a life, and a short time too, depending on how you measure it. Josie still worked at the Golden Spoon, though fewer shifts now, and Harold had promoted her to shift lead, a title that came with a small raise and, more importantly, the authority to make sure no server ever again got assigned a table as somebody's idea of a joke. She'd started a night class, working toward an ASL interpretation certification, something Matteo had encouraged without ever pushing, and Tori had been the very first to sign her congratulations when she passed the qualifying exam, hands moving so fast with excitement, Josie had to ask her to slow down twice. Matteo's world remained, in a lot of ways, exactly what it had always been. Complicated, guarded, carrying weight Josie understood she would probably never see all the edges of. But the wall he'd once described, the one between himself and his sister, had come all the way down and stayed down. Sunday dinners were signed conversations now, full and unhurried. Tori no longer watching mouths and guessing, but simply, finally, being spoken to directly by the brother who loved her. On a bright afternoon in early spring, almost exactly a year after that first lunch, Josie was working a slow Tuesday shift at the Golden Spoon when the bell over the door jingled, and she looked up to see Tori walking in, alone this time, grinning ear to ear, Marcus trailing a respectful few steps behind by the door. "Surprise visit?" Tori signed, sliding into a booth. "Teo's stuck in a meeting. I got bored. Sit with me on your break?" Josie laughed and glanced at the clock. "Give me 10 minutes. When she finally slid into the booth across from Tori, tray of coffee set aside, Tori was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement, hands moving before Josie had even fully sat down. "He's going to ask you," Tori signed. "Soon. I'm not supposed to tell you that, but I've never been good at keeping secrets from you. You're too easy to talk to." Josie felt her whole face go warm. "Tori, I just wanted to say something first," Tori continued, expression softening from excitement into something more serious, more tender. "Before it happens, you gave me my brother back. You have no idea what that's worth. I don't just love you because you're going to be my sister. I loved you before any of that, from the very first day, when you knelt down at that table and looked at me like I mattered." She paused, eyes bright. "You always made me feel like I mattered." Josie reached across the table and took Tori's hands in her own, squeezing gently, unable to sign around the tears blurring her vision. "You always mattered," she said, out loud and with her hands both, wanting Tori to feel it every way she could give it to her. "Everyone should have looked at you first a long time ago. I'm just glad it ended up being me." Tori smiled, wide and unguarded, and outside the diner window spring sunlight spilled gold across the sidewalk, and somewhere across the city, a man in a black coat was wrapping up a meeting early so he could come find the woman who'd taught him, in the end, that the most important conversations of his life had never needed to be spoken out loud at all. They just needed somebody willing to notice. What began as a manager's cruel little joke turned into the thing that finally let a brother and sister truly speak to each other, and turned a waitress nobody bothered to see into the one person a whole family couldn't imagine living without. Sometimes the smallest kindness in a room is the loudest thing in it. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs the reminder that kindness always finds its way back around. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been the person everyone overlooked until the right person finally looked your way? We'd love to hear it. See you in the next one.